Well, here we go again. Now, last time I stopped with the passage of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That was the second law, the second ordinance that Congress passed regarding the land in the West. And that's a very big deal. That's a very important issue, and as I said last time, I think one of the very important decisions in American history, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but the important decision was when Virginia decided, under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, the governor, to relinquish its claim to land in the West and turn it over to Congress. So Congress then passed the Land Ordinance of 1785 to deal with the land as property, as an asset. And now in 1787, they passed the Northwest Ordinance to set up a government. And the point I made was that, all right, that government is not not a republic. It's a appointed governor, and then judges appointed by the governor. So it's not anywhere near a republic. But the point was that that was only a temporary law. I mean, it was to be a transition from a territory to a state. And as soon as there were enough people there, the law spelled out the details. It's kind of complicated. But the law spelled out how you'd start out as a territory, and then when you got enough people, you could become a state. And that's what happened all across the country. Everything went through that process of being a territory and having an appointed governor when it was just first open to the public, and then as time went by, as more people moved in, as it got to be enough population to have a real state government, and then it would become a state. And the point was that as a state, it would be equal to the original states. America is not going to do like England. We're not going to have colonies. We're not going to have subordinate states or lower level. All states will be equal when they're admitted as a state. And all state would have a republican government. One of the rules was that if you want to be a state, you had to write a state constitution, and the state constitution had to provide for a republican government. So that's what we're committed to. I didn't quite finish with that in the last lecture. And I didn't get to what I think was a very important aspect of that whole passage of that ordinance. Congress debated that for months, and it was a very divisive issue. There was an extreme amount of debate over the terms of the Northwest Ordinance. And the issue that really blocked Congress, or that really took up Congress's attention, ended up to be very, very contentious, was an issue that I like to ask students if they can guess, and it's not intuitively obvious, but if you're thinking about it, it's one of the big issues of American history. It will become the biggest controversy in American history. And that, I hope now some of you are getting it, was slavery. Congress had to decide whether or not to allow slavery into the Northwest Territory, and then eventually the states that would be formed out of it. As of 1787, slavery was still not nearly as big an issue as it would become. When we talked earlier, when we were still meeting in the classroom, we talked at one time about cotton. And I told you cotton was not really a major product of the American colonies. We did a little bit of cotton, but not very much. It was not a significant crop. It was not one of the crops that America produced a lot of and exported, like other things that we talked about, such as grains and tobacco and even the vegetables and produce and so forth. Cotton was relatively unimportant until 1794, when the cotton gin was invented. Until 1794, cotton was really not available as a crop because it was so hard and so time-consuming, so laborious to separate the seeds from the fibers. So cotton was not really grown until 1794. Then when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and the mechanical way to separate the seeds from the fiber, then it became a much more serious issue. And cotton was a labor-intensive crop that depended heavily on slavery. So once cotton became a viable crop, once the cotton gin made cotton into one of our big crops, one of the biggest, then slavery became a much more important issue than it had been prior to 1794. So we're talking about the Northwest Ordinance. We're talking about 1787. This is pre-cotton America. Slavery was not nearly as big a question as it would become. But even in 1787, it was a very serious issue that led to a very bitter debate in Congress. And the issue was very simply that Southerners wanted to have slavery in the Northwest Territory so that they could bring their slaves into that territory. And Northerners did not want that to happen. Northerners were not concerned about the moral issue of slavery. Slavery, it's North versus South, as it would become, and as it would remain. It was always North wanting to have no slavery, South wanting to have slavery. It was never that the North was more enlightened, better, more committed to American values, more committed to the idea that all men are created equal. It was always only about money. That's what the debate was about. And Southerners wanted to be able to use slave labor in the Northwest Territory, and Northerners did not want it. But the reason was that the North depended to a much greater extent than the South did on the production of grain. They're wheat farmers. And they did not want slave labor being used in wheat farming. They feared that if slavery were used to grow wheat and compete with northern farmers, that the slave-produced wheat would be cheaper than the wheat grown by normal American middle-class northern farmers. So they wanted to keep slavery out because they feared that they could not compete against slave labor, that free white farmers would not be able to produce wheat as cheaply as slaves. Or if they did, they could do it only with a lower price for wheat and a lower income for themselves, and that they would be reduced to poverty. They were afraid that wheat farming in the Northwest Territory would be done by slaves, and that they would lose their farms to slave owners. And then where are the slave owners going to get all the slaves? Well, Northerners feared that maybe it would be them. That white people could end up as slaves if they were forced to compete against slave labor. So it's really a matter of economics. But there's a very bitter debate, very bitter division in the country over the use of slave labor in the Northwest Territory. And Southerners wanted to be able to do it. Northerners feared that it would threaten their way of life. So that's why they were arguing against slavery. Eventually, the law was passed and it prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. So that meant that, in effect, the Northwest Territory would be non-slave. and the territory then north of the Ohio River, which is what the Northwest Territory was, it was the area north of the Ohio River, that would be off limits to slavery. We don't know how that happened. We don't know how Congress worked out some sort of an agreement that the South would go along with that and accept the fact that they could not take slaves into the Northwest. We believe, on the basis of some sort of unclear evidence, we believe that there was kind of an understanding in Congress in 1787. It's not written down. It doesn't appear in any of the official papers of the Congress. It didn't appear in the law, the Northwest Ordinance. But it seems as though there was kind of an agreement, understood, maybe not written, not official, not legal, but there was an assumption that the Northwest would be off limits to slavery, but in return, the North would agree that the Southwest, the areas of the West below the Ohio River, which would then eventually become the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, that those states would have slavery. Whereas the states that are going to be created out of the Northwest Territory, eventually 5 states were created out of what was originally one territory, the states of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those states would be non-slave. So the country has sort of decided slavery is very controversial, but we'll sort of split the difference. We'll, in this whole West Territory that we acquired from England as a result of the Treaty of Paris and the decision that Britain made to give us that land as part of the settlement of the war, we've divided it in half along the Ohio River. North of that would be no slavery, south of that would be yes slavery. So we've sort of reached an agreement, an understanding, if you will, kind of a compromise on slavery as of 1787. That debate went on for weeks in Congress, and then they finally settled, okay, we'll have no slavery in the Northwest Territory, but on the assumption, on the understanding, sort of unwritten but understood, that the Southwest would be slavery. Now, while that's happening in the West, I might mention that in the original 13 states, the eastern states, it's sort of also working out that states north of a certain line would abolish slavery, but states south of the line would not. Now, the line is called the Mason-Dixon line. That line had been drawn by 2 geographers back in the colonial days as a settlement of a border dispute between the colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Those 2 colonies had argued over the boundary between the colonies, so they had hired 2 surveyors, and this is like in the 1720s, 2 surveyors named Mason and Dixon. And they surveyed the line and said this is the boundary between those 2 colonies, which became the states of Maryland and Pennsylvania. As it turned out, the states from Pennsylvania north all eventually abolished slavery. The states from Maryland south kept slavery. So that although the line, the Mason-Dixon line, had been drawn not with regard to slavery, it was just drawing the boundary between 2 what were then colonies, it became in effect the boundary line between slave states and non-slave states. In the early 1800s, most of the northern states, there are 7 northern states north of the line, moved to abolish slavery. Now they did so very reluctantly. They didn't just rush into it. They didn't say, oh my gosh, we can't have slavery. Slavery it's inhumane. It's contrary to American ideals. It's contrary to our idea that all men are created equal. No, they dragged their feet. They hemmed and hawed. And the ways they did it, every state's a little bit different, but they dragged it out, and they would make it happen over a period of years. One of the common things to do was to say, well, everybody who's a slave now will stay a slave, but anybody that's born from this day forward would be free. But that means as people are born, slowly and slowly there become more free African Americans, but there's still going to be a lot of slaves as long as they continue to live. They didn't want to rush into it, and there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for it. They just did so kind of grudgingly. And the only reason was because in the North there had always been fewer slaves, because northern agriculture was generally not as labor intensive as southern agriculture. Again, it wasn't that people had some feeling against slavery, they thought it was wrong. No, it was just not economically feasible. It's really all about money. Northern states didn't need slaves, so they would say, okay, we'll get rid of it, we'll abolish it, because it just was not important to the economy. For southern states with more labor-intensive agriculture, tobacco, rice, sugar, those are labor-intensive forms of agriculture. Slavery was much more common, so those states kept slavery. It was simply a matter of economics. But it did mean that the country in the original colonies on the East Coast were divided at the Mason-Dixon line. And if you look at a map, the Mason-Dixon line kind of just sort of jigs a little bit when it crosses into the west. But the Ohio River is sort of a continuation of that line. So the country was sort of divided south and north, with the south having slavery and the north not. Not, as I say, because they were opposed to slavery, but just because economically they didn't need it, they didn't want to use slaves, didn't need it for the production of wheat and other grains in the north. So the Northwest Ordinance solved that issue and nailed it down. At least the agreement at the time, the understanding at the time, divided the country north and south on the issue of slavery, but just on the basis of economics. So by passing the Northwest Ordinance, Congress then settled how we're going to govern the West. And as I said, that was used for all the rest of the continent. At the time it applied only to the Northwest, but the same principle was used when the Southwest was acquired by Congress. And as the U.S. acquired other territories to the west of the Mississippi, we used the same principles there of having a territory and then a state. So Congress settled the question of the West. They got the West. That was a big deal for Congress to acquire the West because Virginia gave it to it, and they did a good job of dealing with it. The decisions that Congress made in the 1780s lasted throughout the rest of American history.